The text came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. I know the exact time because I just set my phone down after checking my work email, and when it buzzed again I thought it was a follow-up from my manager. It wasn't. It was my brother. We're doing Thanksgiving at the house this year, just immediate family. Elaine's not comfortable with extra people around the baby. I read it 3 times. Then I set my phone face down on my kitchen counter and stood there for a long moment staring at the backsplash tiles I'd picked out myself in the apartment I paid for myself, thinking about how I'd wired $2,000 to my parents' bank account 6 weeks ago because my father called and said they were behind on the propane bill going into winter. Extra people. That's what I was now. My name is Nora. I'm 31 years old, and I have spent the better part of the last decade being the person in my family who answered the phone when no one else would. The one who drove 4 hours to help my parents move furniture after my dad threw out his back. The one who co-signed a small business loan for my brother when he wanted to open a second location of his landscaping company. The one who sent money when it was needed and asked for nothing back, because asking felt like the wrong thing to do. Like I was putting a price on love that was supposed to be unconditional. His name is Brent. He's 4 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, he has been the son my parents built their pride around. He coached Little League. He married Elaine, who is perfectly pleasant in the way that certain people are perfectly pleasant. Never warm, never genuine, but never openly unkind either. Not until she decides she doesn't need to pretend anymore. They had a baby 8 months ago, a boy they named Tucker, and ever since then I had felt myself slowly being rearranged in the family's constellation, moved further and further from the center, until apparently I was no longer visible at all. I picked my phone back up and typed, "Okay, happy Thanksgiving." Then I put it down, poured myself a glass of water, and didn't sleep until almost 3 in the morning. The thing I need you to understand is that this wasn't the first time. It was just the first time anyone had put it in writing. For the better part of a year, I'd been watching the distance grow. Calls I returned that never got called back. Holiday plans that came together without anyone thinking to include me until I asked. My mother telling me, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound neutral, that Elaine had been under a lot of stress since the baby, and that it was probably better not to push. My father not saying much of anything because my father had spent 40 years taking the path of least resistance in his own home, and he wasn't about to stop now. I lived in Portland. They were all in Medford, about 4.5 hours south, close enough that I'd made the drive more times than I could count over the years. Close enough that when my brother's business was struggling 2 years ago, I could sit across from him at my parents' kitchen table and listen to him talk about what the loan would mean for the company, for his family, for everything he'd worked to build. I'd signed the papers at a notary's office on a Thursday afternoon. The loan was for $60,000. The terms were standard, 5-year repayment, reasonable interest, nothing unusual. My credit was good. I had a stable job in supply chain management, no debt except for my car, money in savings. The bank approved it within a week. Brent thanked me once, briefly, and then never mentioned it again. That was 26 months ago. The week after the Thanksgiving text, I was going through small paperwork. I was reorganizing my home office, trying to actually use the filing cabinet I bought 2 years ago, and immediately stuffed with a chaotic mix of receipts and tax documents and things I'd told myself I'd deal with later. I found the copy of the loan agreement I'd kept. I almost put it in the folder without looking at it, but something made me sit down and read through the whole thing. There was a clause on page 7. I'd read it at the time, or I thought I had, but lawyers write those things in a particular way that makes your eyes slide right over the important parts unless you're specifically looking for them. The clause stated that if the borrower, Brent, defaulted on the loan or became more than 90 days delinquent, the co-signer had the right to assume the outstanding loan balance and, with it, any collateral that had been pledged against the debt. The collateral was the second location, the building Brent had purchased with the loan money. A commercial property on a main road in Medford that he bought for $58,000 and had spent the past 2 years renovating and operating as a second branch of his landscaping and outdoor services company. I flipped back through the payment history I'd kept because I'm thorough like that. It's part of what makes me good at my job. The payments had been coming out of my account and being routed to the bank for the first 8 months. Then Brent started repaying me directly, which I'd allowed because he'd asked and it was easier and I trusted him. Except the last payment I'd received was 14 months ago. I'm not an attorney, but I know enough about contracts to know that I needed to talk to one. Her name was Frances, and a colleague had recommended her. She had an office in a converted bungalow near the Pearl District, and when I sat across from her desk and explained the situation, she read the agreement without saying anything for almost 10 minutes. When she looked up, her expression was careful and precise. "The short version," she said, "is that your brother is currently more than 14 months delinquent. The threshold in this agreement is 90 days. That means the default clause has been technically active for almost a year." She set the document down. "The collateral, the commercial property, can be transferred to you. The process requires notification and a filing period, but there is no legal mechanism that would prevent it, assuming these facts are accurate." I asked her what the property was worth. She pulled up the county assessor's database on her computer. The property had been appraised 7 months ago as part of a routine tax assessment. The value listed was $412,000. I had co-signed a $60,000 loan. My brother had paid back maybe $12,000 of it before stopping entirely, and he had pledged as collateral a commercial property that was now worth nearly 7 times what he'd borrowed. The drive back across the city felt very strange. I kept thinking about the Thanksgiving text. Just immediate family. Elaine's not comfortable with extra people. I thought about every time I'd driven to Medford and sat at that kitchen table feeling like a visitor in a house where I'd grown up. Every time my mother had told me I needed to be more understanding, every time my brother had said we should catch up and then never made it happen, every time I'd sent money and felt a small embarrassing pang of relief when they seemed pleased, like I'd passed a test I hadn't known I was taking. I got home and sat in my car in the parking garage for probably 15 minutes before I went inside. The next morning I texted Brent, not about the loan. I asked how Tucker was doing. He didn't respond for 2 days, and when he did it was a single sentence: "He's great, walking already. Time flies." No question back. No acknowledgement that we hadn't spoken in 6 weeks. No mention of Thanksgiving. I made an appointment with Frances for the following week. She walked me through the process with a patience I appreciated. The notification would go to Brent formally, by certified mail, documenting the default and my intention to exercise the collateral clause. He'd have 30 days to cure the default, meaning pay what he owed, or the transfer proceedings would begin. The total outstanding balance at that point was just over $49,000 plus a small amount of accrued interest. "What happens if he just pays it?" I asked. "Then the default is cured, the collateral clause is void, and you receive payment in full," she said. "Either outcome resolves the loan." I thought about that. $49,000, or a property worth $400,000. Brent didn't have $49,000 sitting in an account. I was certain of that without having to ask. His business was doing better than it had been, but not that kind of liquid better. I asked her to send the letter. The certified mail was delivered on a Thursday. I know because the tracking notification came to my email. Brent called me 40 minutes later. I let it ring. He called 3 more times that afternoon. Then my mother called, which I also let go to voicemail. By evening, my father had tried twice, which was unusual. My father almost never called me directly, preferring to have my mother relay information like a diplomatic envoy between 2 cautious nations. I listened to the voicemails in order. My brother's first message was almost unnervingly calm, just, "Hey, it's me. Call me when you get a chance." By the third one, his voice had a different quality. Not angry, exactly. Tighter. "Nora, I need to talk to you. We need to discuss this." My mother's voicemail was the hardest to listen to. Her voice was soft in the way that means she's scared. "Honey, I don't know what's happening, but your brother is very upset. Can you please just call someone? This doesn't have to be a big thing." I sat with that for a long time. This doesn't have to be a big thing. Because in my family, the things that were big things were the ones that happened to other people. My needs were always the ones that didn't have to be big things. I called Frances in the morning and told her to proceed. The next 2 weeks were uncomfortable in a way that's hard to describe. My family knew I was there. I hadn't gone anywhere. I was answering texts when they came, sending brief and cordial replies, but I wasn't engaging on the topic of the letter. Every time my brother texted something adjacent to it, I responded with something completely unrelated, which I could feel was frustrating him, but I wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. I needed the process to be underway before I talked to anyone, because I knew that once we were talking they would do what my family has always done, which is apply pressure until I concede to keep the peace. I wasn't going to keep the peace this time. My brother finally showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning. This was unexpected. Medford is 4.5 hours away, and Brent has never in my adult life driven to Portland specifically to see me. I found out later that Elaine hadn't wanted him to go, that they'd argued about it, that she thought he should hire an attorney instead. He knocked. I opened the door. He looked tired and thin in a way I hadn't noticed on our last few calls, which had been brief and mostly about logistics. There were shadows under his eyes that I recognized from the year his business nearly collapsed the first time, before the loan. I made coffee. We sat at my kitchen table, which seats 4 and which I eat at alone most mornings, and he looked at his mug for a while before he said anything. "I didn't know you were tracking the payments," he said finally. "I kept records of everything," I said. "I always do. It's been a hard couple of years." He looked up. "The supply chain stuff hit landscaping really badly. You know that. Equipment costs went up almost 40%. I've been reinvesting everything back into the business just to keep it stable." I nodded. I did know that. It was true. I was going to catch up, he said. "I've been meaning to call you about it. I kept putting it off because I didn't know what to say." "You could have said you were struggling," I said. "I would have worked something out with you." "I know," he said it quickly, like he'd been prepared for that sentence. "I know, and that's on me. I should have come to you sooner." There was a pause. "But Nora, this letter, what Francis is doing, you're not actually going to take the building." He said it the way you state a fact, not the way you ask a question. "That depends on whether the default gets cured," I said. He stared at me. "You know I don't have $49,000. "I know." "Then what is this? What are you actually trying to accomplish here?" I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug and thought about how to say what I wanted to say in a way that was fair, that was honest, that wasn't just anger dressed up as reasoning. "Do you remember Thanksgiving?" I asked. He blinked. "What?" "You texted me 6 weeks ago, just immediate family. Elaine's not comfortable with extra people. Do you remember that?" His jaw shifted slightly. "That was a different thing." "Was it?" "Elaine has been struggling with the baby. It wasn't personal." "Brent." I set my mug down. "I co-signed a $60,000 loan for you. I wired money to Mum and Dad 3 times in the last 2 years when they called me. I drove down there 4 times last year for things that needed doing. I have never once, not once, asked any of you for anything in return except to be treated like I belong in this family. And you told me I was extra." He was quiet for a moment. The word landed the way I'd known it would. "I didn't mean it like that," he said, but his voice was less certain now. "I know you didn't mean it the way it sounds," I said. "But that's the thing about how your family treats you. It's never dramatic enough to point to. It's just a lot of small things, one after another, until one day you're standing in your kitchen reading a text that calls you extra and realizing that nobody in your life who is supposed to love you has asked how you're doing in about 4 months. He didn't say anything. "I'm not taking the building to hurt you," I said. "I'm not doing this out of revenge. I'm doing it because for 26 months I've been owed money that I need, and nobody thought it was important enough to prioritize, and I need you to understand that what I do and what I give and what I contribute actually has a cost, that I'm not a resource you draw on when you need something and then put back on the shelf." He left about an hour later. Not angry, or at least not visibly. Subdued in a way I'd never seen him. He hugged me before he walked out, which surprised me enough that I almost said something stupid like "it's okay," but I didn't. I let him hug me and I said I'd be in touch with Francis. My mother called me that night. Not the careful diplomatic call I'd expected, but a real one. a long one, her voice unsteady in a way that made me feel 8 years old and guilty for reasons I couldn't fully articulate. "He's scared," she said. "That building is the whole second half of the business. If you take it, he's been in default for 14 months, Mum. I know, but has anyone asked how I'm doing?" I said quietly. "In the last few months, has anyone called just to ask?" There was a long silence. "I thought you were fine," she said finally. "I know," I said. "That's the whole thing. I know you did." The 30-day cure period ended on a Tuesday. Brent had not paid the outstanding balance. I knew he wouldn't be able to, not without selling the property himself, and he hadn't had time or resources to arrange that. Francis had been in contact with his attorney throughout the period. Yes, he'd finally hired one, and they had been exploring options, but nothing had materialized. I'd spent the 30 days doing something I hadn't told anyone about. I'd called a commercial real estate broker named Walt, who a friend in property management had recommended, and I'd asked him to help me understand what the building could be used for, what its rental potential was, whether it made sense to hold it or sell it. He'd walked through the space with me one afternoon when Brent was there running operations, and it had been profoundly strange touring a building with a broker while my brother moved around us directing his crew, pretending not to watch. The building was good. Walt told me it was actually well positioned, good visibility, solid bones. The renovations Brent had put into it had been done right. He gave me 2 scenarios. I could sell it for roughly the appraised value, or I could retain ownership and lease the commercial space back to Brent's company at market rate, which in that area for that square footage would be around $2,200 a month. I sat with both options for a long time. On the last day of the cure period, I drove to Medford. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I checked into a hotel, had dinner by myself at a diner near the freeway where the coffee was bad and the pie was genuinely excellent, and I thought about what I actually wanted. I didn't want to destroy my brother. I want to be very clear about that, because I think it would be easy to read this story and assume that the property clause was always the point, that I'd been lying in wait, that the Thanksgiving text was the trigger and the building was the weapon. That's not what happened. What happened was that I spent years making myself small and quiet and useful, and someone finally put in writing that even after all of that I was extra, and something in me decided it was done accepting that. But done accepting it doesn't mean burning everything down. I called Brent the next morning from my hotel room. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. "I'm in Medford," I said. "Can we meet?" We met at a coffee shop downtown, just the 2 of us. No Elaine, no parents, no attorneys, though I knew his was reachable by phone if needed. I told him I wasn't going to sell the building. I watched the relief move across his face before I continued. I told him I was going to retain ownership, that he could continue operating the second location under a lease agreement, market rate, drawn up formally by Francis with standard commercial lease terms. The outstanding loan balance would be considered settled by the transfer of the collateral. That was within the terms of the agreement. Francis had confirmed it. Going forward, the lease would be a separate, clean arrangement. He'd be a tenant. I'd be a landlord. He was quiet for a moment. I could see him doing the math. $2,200 a month versus the mortgage payment he'd been carrying, which was higher. I could see him calculating what this cost him and what it didn't. "You're serious," he said. "I'm very serious. And if I can't make the lease payments, then we'd renegotiate, the same way I would have renegotiated the loan payments if you'd called me 14 months ago." I held his gaze. "I am not your enemy, Brent. I have never been your enemy. I just need to stop being invisible." He nodded slowly. He looked down at the table. He looked like a man who has realized that a story he thought he knew had been told to him from one angle only, and that from another angle it looks completely different. "The Thanksgiving thing," he said. "I know how it came across." "I don't need an apology," I said. "I need it to not happen again." He looked up. "It won't." I don't know if he meant it the way I needed him to mean it. I don't know if one conversation can undo the years of accumulated smallness that had built up between us. Families are complicated in ways that don't resolve cleanly, and I'd spent enough time waiting for clean resolutions to know they don't come. But here is what I know. I drove back to Portland that afternoon with the signed letter of intent from Brent's attorney, and a call scheduled with Francis to begin drafting the lease. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was bracing for something. My parents called that evening, together, which they almost never do. My mother usually calls alone and relays things to my father later. They were on speaker, and my father's voice was a little rough in the way it gets when he's feeling something he doesn't have the vocabulary for. "Your brother explained what you worked out," my mother said. "Yes, he said it was fair. I think it is." There was a pause. My father said, "You should have told us you were struggling." I almost laughed. Not meanly, there was something genuinely touching about it, this attempt to locate the problem somewhere solvable. "I wasn't struggling, Dad. That's not what this was about." Another pause. "We should have called more," my mother said quietly. "Yes," I said, "you should have. That was it. No grand reconciliation, no tearful confession. My family doesn't operate that way, and I've made a kind of peace with that. Not the peace of accepting less than I deserve, but the peace of seeing clearly what I'm working with and deciding to stay anyway, on different terms." The lease was finalized 3 weeks later. Brent's company is still operating out of that building. He pays on time every month, because now there are real consequences if he doesn't, and real consequences have a clarifying effect on people who never had to experience them before. My mother and I talk more now. Not every week, but more than before. She asks how I'm doing in a way that suggests she's actually listening for the answer, rather than waiting to move on to other topics. My father still communicates primarily through my mother, but he sent me a gift card for my birthday this year with a note in his handwriting that said, "Proud of you, kiddo," which is more than I've gotten from him in years, and more than I'm going to pretend doesn't matter. Elaine sent me a text in December. It said, "Tucker would love to see you at Christmas if you want to come." I read it several times, looking for the angle. Then I decided that looking for the angle was a way of staying in the defensive crouch I'd been in for years, and I didn't want to do that anymore. I went for Christmas. I held Tucker, who was a very serious baby with large dark eyes, and who studied my face with the concentrated attention of someone trying to place a familiar song. Elaine made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table and talked about nothing important for a while, and it was a little stiff and a little careful, and also completely fine. That's the truth about how these things end. Not with a dramatic reversal, not with the people who hurt you finally understanding what they did and transforming into the family you always needed. They end with something smaller and more real. A lease agreement, a birthday note, a baby who doesn't know anything about any of this, looking at you like you're just another person in his world, which is exactly what you are, and maybe exactly enough. I have a property in Medford now. I didn't go looking for it. I found it inside a filing cabinet on a quiet night when I was trying to get organized, inside a document I'd almost set aside, inside a clause I'd almost read past. I almost let it go. I almost put the folder away and poured another glass of water and gone to bed and kept being who I had always been in that family. I'm glad I didn't. Not because the property changed my life, it didn't, not materially, not yet, but because the process of claiming it changed something in how I understood myself. The person who signed those loan papers 6 years ago believed that being useful was the same as being loved, that generosity without limits was a virtue rather than a pattern, that eventually the people who took what she offered would notice the cost and be grateful. I don't believe that anymore. I believe that love without accountability is just habit, dressed up as affection, and that the people who will actually stay in your life are the ones who can hear no, and this matters to me without disappearing. My family stayed, imperfectly, awkwardly, in the specific way that families stay, with a lot of things left unsaid and a lot of new ground being navigated carefully. But they stayed, and I stopped being extra. If any of this feels familiar, if you've been the one who signs the papers and drives the 4 hours and wires the money and waits for someone to notice, I want you to know that I see you. I know what it costs to hold all of that quietly. I know how long you can do it before something has to give. If you're there right now, stay close. There's more to this kind of story than the hurt. There's also what comes after. I used to think that patience was the same thing as virtue, that if I kept showing up, kept being useful, kept making myself easy to love, eventually the people I was doing it for would notice, not in a transactional way. I wasn't keeping score, or at least I told myself I wasn't. I just believed, somewhere beneath the part of me that should have known better, that what you give eventually comes back to you in kind. It doesn't. Not automatically. Not without accountability. What I understand now is that the way people treat you is a kind of information, and for a long time I refused to read it clearly. Every unanswered call, every holiday plan that came together without me, every time I wired money and received silence in return, that was information. I chose to interpret it charitably instead of honestly, because honesty would have required me to do something about it, and doing something felt harder than staying quiet. The word extra in Brent's text did something that years of smaller things hadn't quite managed. It named what I'd been feeling without naming it, and once something is named, you can't unknow it. I want to be careful here, because I don't think what happened between Brent and me is a story about a bad person getting what he deserved. He's not a bad person. He's someone who got comfortable taking from someone who made taking easy. And he never had a reason to examine that until the reason arrived certified mail with Francis's name on the return address. The people who take without thinking aren't always cruel. Sometimes they're just careless, and carelessness is its own kind of harm. What I did, filing that notification, letting the 30 days run, sitting across from him in that coffee shop and telling him the terms, wasn't revenge. I've thought about that word a lot, and it doesn't fit. Revenge is about making someone feel what you felt. This was about making my reality visible to people who had decided, without meaning to, that it didn't quite exist. The property in Medford sits on a county assessor's database now, with my name on it. Brent's crew shows up every morning and does good work, the same as they always did. I deposit the lease payment on the 1st of every month, and it arrives on time because now it matters in a concrete and documented way whether it does. That's not punishment. That's just how accountability works when you finally stop waving it. The harder lesson, the one I'm still sitting with, is about what I owe myself going forward, not in a loud way, just the ordinary daily version of it, reading the information people give me instead of rewriting it into something more comfortable. Saying what I need before 40 months of silence makes the saying necessary. Letting the people I love carry their own weight, not because I'm withholding, but because carrying it for them was preventing them from knowing they could. Nora from a year ago would have put the folder back in the filing cabinet. She would have told herself she'd deal with it later, poured a glass of water, gone to bed. I'm glad she didn't. And I think, somewhere under all the discomfort it caused him, Brent might be too.